Great Plains Epi for collaborating with us, the Great Plains Tribal Opioid Response Program, to bring this training series to our tribal communities, our community members, and tribal leaders. Just a few housekeeping things before we turn it over. Haley and Brooke will be monitoring our Facebook Live sessions. So if there's any questions, they'll be putting those either in the chat or raising their hand. If any of our participants have any, or our attendees have any questions throughout the session, would you please raise your hand, and we'll pause and at the appropriate time and have you ask your question. Otherwise, if you could please put your self on mute, that would be fantastic, so we don't have any background noise coming through. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Griffith. Thank you for coming today and being here with us and providing us with your wisdom and expertise.
Okay.
I'm going to turn it over to you. I'll start sharing my screen, and you just let me know when I need to flip through, okay?
All right. So welcome, everybody. I wanted to start by saying 120 people die daily nationwide due to drug overdose. How many of these losses are occurring in Indian country? The consequences of illicit drug use are widespread, causing permanent physical and emotional damage to users and negatively impacting families, co-workers, and others with whom they have contact. Drug use, and I will often refer to alcohol, negatively impacts a user's health, often leading to sickness and disease. In many cases, users die prematurely from drug overdoses or other drug or alcohol-related issues. Some users are parents whose deaths leave their children in the care of relatives or in the foster care system. Drug law violations constitute a substantial portion of incarcerations in local, state, and federal facilities and represent the most common arrest category. Prescription drugs are a huge problem in Indian country, and they result in more overdoses than heroin and cocaine combined. Substance misuse is the use of alcohol or illicit prescription drugs in a manner that may cause harm to users and to those around them. Harm can include overdoses, interpersonal violence, motor vehicle accidents, domestic violence, as well as homicide and suicide, suicide is the leading cause of death in adolescents and young adults in the age category of 12 to 25. Drugs are too easily accessible and available. They can be obtained from hospitals, friends, peers, and family members. They're often obtained through sharing, purchase, or even theft. There are sources willing to bring drugs onto the reservation. The Mexican drug cartels love Indian country. They target us because they think that we are an easy target. It can be extremely profitable for them, so they are willing to do whatever it takes to get those drugs to the reservation. We usually associate access to drugs as being easier in the metropolitan area, but they're becoming even more prevalent on Indian reservations, regardless of how remote they are. As a former addiction provider, I saw my share of illegal drug use, including the abuse of prescription medications. My goal was always to help the patient get clean and stay that way. I always considered how their drug use impacted their families, but I never saw through to see how it impacted their communities, and that's really what we're looking at today. So I will talk a little bit more about the social, economic, health, and public safety tools throughout my presentation. Next slide. Go ahead and go to the next one. Okay. And then you can go ahead to the next one. Thank you. So I came across this quote on the top there while researching this topic, and this is the second time I've given this presentation. It was part of an article written about some Northwestern tribes and the issues that they were dealing with drugs. and alcohol. I believe it's relatable to all Indian tribes, although it reads a little bit awkward, the message is there. According to IHS reservation communities, care needs exceed their funding every year, which has nationally been estimated to cover only 55% of the needs through IHS. That's pretty staggering when you think about that only about half of the needs of IHS are being met. When you throw in the fact that you've got these people that are using drugs to the detriment of their health, and that domino effect that causes throughout their community and their families, then that 55% does not nearly begin to address any of the needs that they have, IHS has. I found an article about 10 years ago where it said that 60% of IHS care needs were being met. So it's easy to say that in 10 years, we've lost 5%. Now we're at only 55%. As Indian tribes, we obviously have our share of challenges, but why do we complicate them by adding excessive use of drugs and alcohol? That is the million-dollar question. I wish I had the answer to it. I don't think anybody can answer that question. As mental health professionals, we are never prepared to accept the full impact of illicit drugs and alcohol in our families and friends. To take it a step further, how does the cost of those addictions relate to the infrastructure of the community and to the tribe? How does it impact our tribal communities? Next slide. So this is alarming, but is it surprising? This statement breaks down substance abuse to use, abuse, and dependence. And we are leading the country in all three categories. That is just staggering when you think about it. I mean, that's something that we have to change in Indian country. Then when we add all these SUD issues on top of all the health issues that we already have, we definitely have reason to be concerned. Nationwide, Native Americans are at least twice as likely as the general population to become addicted to drugs and alcohol, and 3 times as likely to die of a drug overdose. In one state alone, Indians die at the rate of 29 to 100,000. That's more than half of what whites are dying of the same thing. So you compare that, 12 for 100,000 of whites, 11 deaths for 100,000 of blacks, 3 deaths for Hispanics out of 100,000, and 2 out of 100,000 for Asians. We're at 29. So there's significant concern for that. We often hear the statement that the youth of our communities, you can switch this, go on to the next one. Oh, no, I'm sorry, go back. Thank you. We often hear the statement that the youth of our communities are our future. I mean, that's something that we strongly believe in. We think they're going to be the ones that are going to be taking care of us when we're old. Yet many of our youth are introduced to drugs and alcohol right in our very own homes. We allow them to use in our presence, believing that they are safe under our supervision. We buy alcohol for them and their friends with the understanding that they remain in our home while they use it. We smoke pot with them, believing it will not lead to more serious forms of drug use. Most youth are not prepared for these kind of responsibilities, not the kind of responsibilities that come with using substances of any kind. Should we really be taking the risk with our own children by introducing them to things that will cloud their judgment, reduce their motivation, and lead them to make poor decisions? They're capable of doing that on their own. I have worked with Native kids who began using substances as early as 8 years old. But the average age of experimentation is usually about 12, even 12. I mean, 12 is still too young for these kids to be experimenting with these drugs. According to a study by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, 61% of American Indians in 10th grade had used marijuana, compared to 33% of the general population. So think about that. That's twice as much, 61% compared to 33% in non-Indian communities. This next one is even more disconcerting: the use of heroin, and often the use of opioids and the painkiller OxyContin. We're also double the national average of students by the 12th grade. They have used OxyContin or heroin. It's double the national average. So where are they getting it from? How are they getting access to these drugs, and especially heroin? I mean, that's a street drug. So the second half of this statement is probably the most concerning. The study states prolonged use and more negative consequences. Once introduced to drugs and alcohol, especially by family members, what incentives do they have to quit? Getting caught is no longer a worry. I know when I was a teenager, fear of getting caught by my parents kept me from getting into trouble. My mother was always waiting at the front door. She's smelling us. We better not smell like alcohol. We better not smell like marijuana. We better not even smell like cigarettes, or we were in trouble. So severe substance use disorders are called addictions because substances have powerful effects on the developing adolescent brain. Young adults who misuse substances are at an increased risk of developing a substance use disorder at some point in their life. So if they start using young, the potential for it to become a habit for them is very, it's present. I once worked with a native high school kid who drove 3.5 hours every single weekend to the reservation to buy pot. And he was very forthcoming with me. He told me he was doing that in therapy. And I asked him one day, I said, why do you do that? Why do you drive 7 hours every weekend to go get pot? 3.5 hours. Next weekend, you're 3.5 hours to go get this pot. And he said, I get it because I sell it at school and it makes me popular. Now, this is a guy that was already a stellar athlete and a good student. I mean, by all appearances, he looked like he was the kid that had it all, but he was also the kid selling marijuana at school. At one point, he had gone to a party with several of his friends, and on the way back from the party, they were involved in a head-on collision. He didn't get hurt, but his best friend, who was driving his car at the time, nearly lost his life. And that didn't really impact him. That didn't slow him down. He continued to drink every weekend. He continued to use drugs. There's a thing called personal fable. And it's the belief held by adolescents that no matter what they do, they're very unique and none of life's difficulties will touch them, even if they use the worst behavior. So a lot of these kids think they're untouchable when it comes to this stuff. So next slide. These are the areas that are most impacted in Indian country. We've got our healthcare. Drug users often require hospital visits that are costly to the community. These visits are often related to psychotic episodes, adverse drug reactions, overdoses, even infectious diseases that are transmitted through drug injections. Hospitals also spend a significant amount of money on treating victims of crimes perpetrated by drug users. The result is a huge debt that comes from individuals using drugs and alcohol in an irresponsible manner. Furthermore, will IHS be able to keep up the care for these people? What about pharmacy budget? Calling for more pain medications. In addition, some of these hospitals have methadone clinics, they have Suboxone clinics. That's a huge expense. These are used to get people off of heroin and opioids. STDs. While under the influence, a person's inhibitions go down and the risk goes way up. Dental services, especially while using meth, users' teeth are severely damaged. I've also heard horror stories about people knocking out their own teeth and going to dental so that they can get more pain medication. Prenatal exposure to drugs and alcohol. I've worked with several Indian children suffering from FAA and FAS. Many will struggle throughout their social and academic careers. Some of them may never be able to live on their own. Social and familial issues include child neglect and abuse. I have worked with way too many children who were impacted by this. I once worked with a woman who had 5 children. She eventually lost those 5 children because she kept driving around drunk with them in her car. She was arrested for DUI, and Children and Family Services didn't have anywhere to place her 5 children, so they stayed within the family. She and the children went through extensive months of therapy, many, many months of therapy, only for her to do it all over again, and this time lose her kids. So what does it take to sober someone up like this? I mean, you have the most adverse consequences as a result of your use, yet you continue to do it. Next slide. So we're talking also about the legal area. 53% of federal prisoners are incarcerated because of drug problems. Tribal communities continue to be particularly vulnerable to crime given the serious lack of federal funding for adequate criminal justice presence. This results in increased legal costs for the tribe and for drug, alcohol-related arrests and incarcerations. What happens when our tribal jails are at capacity with substance abusers? And then there's the added issue of detox. Detoxing is a dangerous thing. Sometimes it happens in hospitals and sometimes it happens in jail. A person can lose their life by detoxing. Then we add the increase in domestic violence, assaults, burglaries, child abuse, and neglect. Tribal court problems include overwhelming caseloads, limited program resources, and reoccurring clients. Research has found 3 significant links between crime and drug use. The first of these is called psychopharmacological crime, which is a crime committed under the influence of drugs. Studies show that in some locations, as many as 55% of offenders were under the influence when the crime was committed. 19% said they would commit the crime without drugs. So you look at 55%, that's more than half of offenders under the influence would commit a crime. Another link is economic compulsive crime. This is the type of crime where a person who is addicted to alcohol or drugs engages in crime in order to support their habit. 17% of the United States state prison population prisoners supported their habit that way. 19% of federal inmates admitted to committing that crime in order to obtain cash to buy their drugs. The third major link is systemic crime, which is violence over drug turf. Fighting between users and sellers and other similar crimes. Just fighting amongst themselves in order to gain their drugs. So public safety is a big area that is impacted by drugs. And 75% of tribal law enforcement identified meth as the greatest drug threat in Indian country. Meth distribution and abuse contributes to violent and property crime rates. 90% of tribal law enforcement need investigation training. Only 45% of them have received that training. So you think about that must be a substantial cost in order to get this training, in the fact that only less than half of tribal employees who need it, tribal law enforcement employees who need it have received it. This is a huge expense that unfortunately is necessary in order to keep our communities safe. Behavioral social problems. Substance abusers may have chronic mental illness. I worked in a dual diagnosis program where ongoing argument was whether to resolve the mental health issue first or whether to resolve the substance abuse. We could never agree on what the correct answer was to that question. They appear to drive each other. Psychologically, depression runs high in those who abuse substances. Many substances are natural depressants. There may be that short period of happiness, well-being, and or euphoria, but it's usually followed by depression, especially with meth and alcohol. I find it in my career as a psychologist that those with bipolar disorder can be the most difficult to work with when it comes to substances. Their moods are like a roller coaster. Medication can help, but their preference is self-medication. Bipolar disorder is very common in Native people, and there's a very strong genetic component for it. So in addition to our addiction issues that we're passing down, we are also passing down our mental health issues. Economic impacts. 30% of a tribe, who I won't mention their name, but 30% of one certain tribe, all of their employees tested, not all of their employees, but 30% of their employees tested positive for meth. That to me is sobering right there. 30% of your employee population testing positive for meth. So that goes on to talk a little bit more about employment. How many ways are jobs impacted due to substance abuse? The first thing that comes to mind is lack of attendance. There may be a lack of attention to detail, lack of follow-through, being unreliable, and being distracted. A person under the influence is much more at risk of a work-related accident than anyone else. Indian country depends a lot on grants, and those may not be getting completed. There's the lack of follow-through. That means less money available and for tribal programs. And just using meth as one example, meth will cost an employer $50,000 to $60,000 a year in lost productivity, theft, absenteeism, increased health care costs, and workman's comp. Education. Our high school dropout rate in Indian country is already higher than the national average. What happens when we have youth who start using substances early on? We have teens who may not see education as a priority or see the value of an education. Add that to the hopelessness that they may be experiencing, and what can they possibly see for their future? Let's talk about rehabilitation. A person may go to rehab up to 12 times before full recovery is achieved. So how much money does one rehab stint cost? I have heard that it can be up to $30,000. So let's multiply that by 12. And that gives you an idea of how much money could be spent on one person getting clean and sober. The lifelong nature of addiction and the increasing availability of heroin and other illicit opioids demand more investment be made every year, particularly for recovery housing and support services. Nearly all tribes provide some level of addiction services. They provide needle exchange programs, naloxone, Narcan training, distribution. Recovery housing may also be available, although funding is always limited in that area. Substance abuse programs can literally eat up an already strained budget. For most individuals, they will enter several programs before they become clean and sober. Some may never become clean and sober, and that leads to other issues that can affect an already strained budget. Psychological. Behavioral health services may be warranted to help that person achieve sobriety, but we are often limited on reservations. The best approach is a dual diagnosis program that addresses both their addiction and what may have led them to begin using. Next slide. So what kind of drugs are most prevalent in reservation communities? In the early 2000s, tribal service providers and law enforcement agencies began reporting that families were seen at selling their furniture, personal belongings, heirlooms, regalia, cars, homes, and some instances prostituting their children to obtain cash to continue their meth addiction. So meth is the biggest problem seen on reservations right now. Not only is meth probably the worst drug out there, it has the highest crime rate attached to it. Health-wise, the first time you use meth, you can have a heart attack or a stroke. That is how powerful meth is. I don't believe there's any part of the human body that meth does not adversely impact. And 98% of all people who tried meth became addicted. That's very scary. That's a very scary number to hear right there. Years ago, there was a documentary on meth called Montana Meth. The main message from that documentary was, the first time you use meth, you'll feel the best and the worst you've ever felt in your life. Using meth for the first time burns out a dopamine pleasure area. And you will never have that first euphoric feeling, that feeling of well-being. You'll never have that back again. It doesn't matter how much you use or how long you use it. You will never feel as good as the first time that you used meth. I think if we could get that message out to people, they would probably never try it, ever, that very first time. So the second problem area in Indian country is opioids. 33,000 people died due to opioid overdoses in 2015. In 2016, 64,000 died. So we doubled the number in 1 year. In 2019, 81,000 died. Now, it did slow down a little bit, but I think the reason for that was because more EMTs, police officers, firefighters, they're using the Narcan. So you are able to bring them out of an overdose. I think that's helped significantly. Our country alone, the United States, uses 85% of all opioids produced worldwide. Just think about that for a minute. 85% of all opioids that are produced worldwide are being used in this country. Back in 2012, 259 million prescriptions were written for opioids, which is more than enough to give every American adult their own bottle of pills. There was another documentary, I'm not sure if it was on HBO or not, but it was talking about a small town outside of Boston. And the cemetery in that small town is full of adolescents ages 18 to 21 who have all overdosed on opioids. And it's just tombstone after tombstone of these young kids who got into the opioids, eventually got into heroin, and died because of the heroin use. It's such a waste of human life. There's another story about two boys grew up from their very earliest childhood until they were in high school. And they both overdosed on the very same day, just within miles of each other. That's how powerful and addicting opioids are. And although they affect all age groups, they are affecting our youth dramatically. I once went to the doctor. I had a lower back issue. And without asking me too many questions, he wrote me 3 prescriptions: hydrocodone, Flexeril, and anti-inflammatory. In reality, the anti-inflammatory was the only thing that I needed. So the other 2 didn't get used. Heroin. When opioids become scarce, people will turn to heroin. 4 out of 5 heroin users stated that they started out misusing prescription pain medications. When addicts turn to heroin, that is when the fear of the overdose occurs. You'll have people who they'll use heroin, they'll use it for a while, they get off of it, they relapse, they go back to using just what they were using when they quit using the heroin, and ultimately they overdose. And that's where the Narcan and the naloxone comes in handy. I personally believe that heroin will be the last drug that anybody uses because it is the one that has the highest death rate. Many police departments and EMTs are now administering Narcan for those overdoses. So that's an additional expense. There's the expense of the Narcan, but there's also the expense of the training for that. So we add that in with everything else related to drugs, and we're really dealing with some expensive problems there. Cocaine is much too expensive for most people to use on a regular basis, but crack is a ready alternative. In my years of drug experience working with people, I met very, very few people who had a long-term problem with crack. But I do know one person who their crack addiction led them to death. Because eventually with crack, they wear out their lungs. Inhalants. Years ago, while doing my PhD training in Albuquerque, you could pull up to any 7-Eleven any time of the day or night and see people sitting out there at the side of the building with silver or gold paint on their faces and on their hands. Unfortunately, I've seen the same thing on the reservation. I mean, it's a sad thing to see, and inhalants they're the worst. I mean, they affect your brain, the way your brain operates, and you just become a shell of a person after using them. They have very long-term effects using inhalants. I've seen people who have used Duster, the Duster stuff that you use on your keyboards, and that stuff freezes. So that also freezes like your lungs when you inhale that. I did some training in graduate school at Circle of Nations boarding school. And we had an event one night where we invited some of the girls from the dorms to do some crafts. And it was at one of the people's houses there on campus. Well, we learned after everybody had gone home that the girls had found a can of Lysol in the bathroom, and they were all going into the bathroom to huff Lysol. So that was a little disturbing. Marijuana, I believe as time goes by, we will discover that marijuana is probably smoking it is a little bit more detrimental to our health than we are willing to admit. I do believe there are some viable health benefits, especially to cancer patients. On the other hand, it does take away a person's motivation and in turn may affect economics in the same way that other drugs also affect the economics. Next slide. I read a story about a recovering Native American woman, and she shared that she grew up with addiction in her family. She was the oldest of 4, and she cared for her younger siblings when her parents went out and used drugs and alcohol. She said, when I was growing up, she said, I hated drugs because I saw what they did to my family. They tore them apart. Yet, when she got into junior high, she started following the same path. She started smoking marijuana in junior high, moved on to meth when she was in her late teens, and prescription painkillers and heroin by the time she was in her early 20s. She signed up for addiction treatment at least 13 times over the years and went to drug court, but never really had her heart in it. She said, I was just manipulating the system so that I could be with my kids. Are families ready or able to pay outrageous medical or possibly funeral bills? We save money for vacations. We save money for a new car or a new home, for retirement. We don't expect to spend our hard-earned money on health issues related to substance abuse, or worse, for the unexpected death of someone we love. There's not one of these areas that does not impact the financial economy of the tribe. Some tribes are just getting by financially, while others are more fortunate. But how can we focus on positive things that we want for our people, such as wellness centers, programs for our elders and our babies, and providing jobs when substance abuse is such a drain on that economy? How can we not take marijuana seriously? When I was a teen, it was called a gateway drug. I believe it probably is still called that. Now we can buy medical marijuana in forms of edibles and gummies. We don't have to smoke it anymore. We can just eat a gummy and get a buzz. Next slide. Addiction in Indian country is truly an intergenerational problem. When it becomes so normalized to our children, that is the problem. If you have a child who watches their parent come in from work every day, sit down, drink a case of beer, or use a drug, that becomes normalized to them. That is what they see every single day. So they don't think anything, they think that's the way life is. They fail to see it as a problem. That is the scariest part about addictions and the hardest thought process to correct throughout all this. We can change our friends, but what do we do about our family? While working in North Dakota, I worked with several social service agencies. I had children coming in who were talking about their grandparents going to jail for drugs and alcohol. That becomes normal for them. But our grandparents, especially in our culture, are supposed to be the ones who teach us important life lessons and good ways to live our lives. Not how to game your probation officer and beat your drug test. I worked with a 12-year-old boy who was taking care of 5 younger children in his household. Some of them were his siblings, some of them were his cousins. He did that while his mom and his aunt used meth. When they were arrested and jailed for meth, the kids were sent out to foster care. I started seeing this 12-year-old boy. And when I first started seeing him, he wasn't even attending school at the age of 12. He was home taking care of children. But when he went into foster care, he regressed to the age of a very young child. He quit speaking, he soiled his clothes, and he wet the bed because he had never been a chance to be a child. He had always been an adult. He was in the system for about 5 or 6 months while his mom and his aunt were in jail. And they were finally released. Supposedly they were considered recovered and rehabilitated, and they allowed all of the children to go back home again. He instantly stepped in the caretaking role. And when I saw him and his mother together, his mother was bragging about how responsible he was now, taking care of the kids and everything. And I don't think she ever really realized what the true burden was on this young child, having to take care of all those kids. Our families can be torn apart by these issues, but would it be safe to say that most families have an enabler or two? Drugs can mean financial ruin for a family. What about the increase in domestic violence and the toll that it takes on our families? The removal of children due to neglect and abuse. Another problem that we have in Indian country is a growing problem is Indian youth gangs. They continue to increase on reservations, and they emulate Hispanic, African American, or Caucasian gangs. Indian youth gang names include Native Mob and Native Pride, which primarily operate in North and South Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. That's something we got to keep our eyes open for, because those youth gangs grow up to be adult gangs and continue to perpetrate this crime against our family members, our community members. Next slide.
That's the end of your presentation that I have, Dr.
Okay.
Pepper.
Okay, it must not have all went through. So I'll just continue. I don't have too much more. Along with our children, our elders should be one of our most valuable commodities. While researching information for my presentation, I came across an ad that said, "My grandmother was one of my best friends until she got in the way of me getting my drugs." And it shows a picture of a woman sitting on a kitchen floor, all bruised up and bleeding. That is the power of some of these drugs. Finally, putting aside all the economic loss and burden to tribal economies, we have lost so much more. Do we allow drugs and alcohol to continue to keep us from who we are and who we should be as a tribal community? We need to return to our roots. We need to remember what is important to our survival. It all begins with us. We have to be the role models and positive examples to our children and grandchildren. Although addiction may seem like an insurmountable problem at times, we can start by making an impact ourselves in our communities and in the process, inspire other tribal community members to do the same. And that's the end. Are there any
Thank you,
questions?
Dr. Griffith. I'm sorry. I'm wondering if any of our participants have any questions. Do we have any? I have a question myself.
Okay.
So do we have an estimated, and maybe you mentioned this and I just missed it, but do we have an estimated figures of how much money it costs our tribal communities, how much they lose? I know we talked about how much having an employee with meth was like $50,000 to $60,000 a year.
Yes.
But what kind of information do we have around, we always look at sustainability, we look at creating economic opportunities within our tribal communities and on our reservations. And I'm wondering about the impacts of those types of things with the substance use.
Well, and the problem is there's not a lot of information out there on this impact on tribal communities. I mean, I really had a difficult time finding information, so I'm not sure that number has ever been put out there.
I think for me, one of the scariest things, I mean, knock on wood, and I feel very fortunate that neither one of my children are suffer from substance use disorder. However, they still scare me at the thought of them having to take care of me when I'm old. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine about what's going to happen to our elders as we all become older, and having to rely on people that are going to be in leadership positions,
right
that are going to be making the decision makers of our community,
our tribal council.
Exactly. Those are some scary things,
Yes.
And I think it really threatens our tribal sovereignty, such as it is, because whenever, we all know we get federal funds for these things, and, how is that going to be jeopardized?
I'll tell you something else that's very scary is the earlier that an adolescent begins using drugs, when they really get to the height of their use, so say 18 years old is when they get really ramped up and start using, they may continue throughout their 20s and 30s using drugs. And so maybe they turn 40 years old and they decide they want to quit. In their brain, they're still stuck at 18 because their brain, it got stopped at that point. I mean, they're still operating, they're still doing what they need to do, they can work a job, whatever, but they're stunted at that point. And so when a person gets clean and sober, they almost have to go back to this point and try it over again. And you may not ever be able to catch up at that point.
Yeah, I've heard that for a long time, that this psychologically people will
regress. Yeah. I see some questions in the chat box.
Yeah, what is the impact on children who are returned to the homes repeatedly? Will the will the increase their potential for use? Probably will it increase their potential for use?
Yes, it will, because that becomes the norm for them. You know, like I said in that one statement, say you got dad and mom come home every day from work, and next thing you know, they're in the refrigerator drinking beer, and they finish off a case of beer. You see that every single day. It becomes normalized for you. There is nothing in your eyes wrong with that. They come home and they're sitting there and they're smoking weed and everything like that. You know, hey, mom and dad did it, so it must be okay for me. And that's the mentality. That's the way it becomes. I once worked with a guy that he was an adult. He come from a family of 12 kids. 6 of those kids became doctors, lawyers, judges. The other 6 became drug addicts. There's no rhyme or reason. And his parents were straight. They didn't use drugs and alcohol. So sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to why people become addicts and alcoholics. But I can tell you, if you have that example set in front of you day after day after day, that is what becomes normal to you. So it increases your chance of eventually going down that same road.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have other questions? Here's one. I've noticed an increase in meth-induced psychosis that does not go away even after the drug is no longer in their system. This is a really scary thing that is becoming more and more common. It becomes hard to get the correct referral for these clients as they are not in a state that can be treated for their substance use. And I agree. Thank you, Jamie. I've seen the same thing, and it is very, very concerning.
You can't treat psychotic, and plus the damage they've done to their brain, there's no coming back from that. I mean, you really hate to give up on somebody and say, you know, hey, I want to give this guy all this help, but he's in this psychotic state. He may never, ever, ever come back from that psychotic state again because of the damage he's done to his brain. That is alarming.
Brooke and Haley, do we have any questions on the Facebook live stream?
There wasn't any on the HHA page.
Thank you, Haley.
I don't have any on my end either. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. Well, Dr. Griffith, would your presentation, would you be willing to share that with, would you be willing to let us post that on our tribal opioids page?
Sure.
Okay, great. That would be fantastic. Do we have any other questions before we round out this session? I don't think so. I really want to thank you, Dr. Griffith, for being here with us today and providing us with all your wisdom and information. I am going to put a survey link in the chat box right now. And I'm going to ask that all of our participants be able to go and complete that. And I want to tell you, I'm not even going to try to say her last name, but Dr. Denise is going to talk about historical and intergenerational trauma next week, next Wednesday.
Baudère. Yeah.
What's her last name?
Baudère.
Okay. I'm gonna let that stay with you because I don't want to butcher it.
It's a tough one.
But I look forward to that. I want to invite everybody to come back. Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Griffith, and I want to thank our EPI, our HPOG, and our Native Connections, and most of all, SAMHSA, for the ability to be able to provide these webinar sessions. Thank you all so much. Have a beautiful rest of your day because it is gorgeous here in Rapid City. So I hope that you all are as blessed as we are. Thank you.
So much. Bye-bye.